Howdy, and welcome to another episode of Untold Tales from this side of nowhere. I'm your host, Connor Jones, and I'm recording this week in Southern California. Yes, my wife and I flew down here because it is my oldest brother-in-law's 40th birthday, and we are celebrating his birthday by coming down to Disneyland. So I am recording underneath a palm tree. Hopefully I don't get hit by a coconut. Before we get started, we do have a couple of sponsors. First off, we're sponsored by the Copper Corner Cafe in Basin, Wyoming. If you're headed south to Thermopolis through Basin or north to the Bighorns, stop by the Copper Corner. The Copper is open for breakfast, lunch, and dinner Monday through Saturday from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. Stop by and try any of their delicious menu items featuring homemade bread for all sandwiches and, of course, their famous pie for dessert. Breakfast is served all day, so come on in to the Copper Corner Cafe. We're also sponsored by the Wyoming Welcome Program. The Wyoming Welcome Program offers two advertising solutions, including Table Talk and the Wyoming Welcome Baskets. If you would like to be included in either of them, it's easy to contact them. You can reach out to Haley J, that's HALEYJ, at wyomingwelcome.com, or you can reach out via phone at 406-559-0355. Table Talk brochures are placed on tables in Cody and Powell at restaurants, and they include jokes, the month's holidays, and interesting information about Wyoming, as well as businesses information. So you can either place your business ad in one of those brochures, or you can also include them in a Wyoming Welcome Basket, which is distributed to new move-ins to Park County. Their service is affordable and effective, so be sure to shoot them an email or give them a call. As I said, I am in Southern California, and a huge birthday shout out to my brother-in-law, Aaron. Happy birthday, Aaron, on your 40th. And also, a happy birthday to his wife, Janelle. They both have September birthdays, and they're celebrating in style this weekend here in Southern California. We've escaped some of the heat of Wyoming, though I guess we have cooled down since we've been in California. But when we left, it was plenty warm up there. Weather's been around like 79 degrees. It's beautiful. And we went into Disneyland about as early as you can get there. Made the rope drop. If you don't know what the rope drop is, it's kind of like a starting line for people when they get into Disneyland. So we were there bright and early and didn't leave till pretty close to closing. So my health app on my phone says I got over 30,000 steps yesterday. So we probably got the most out of our Disneyland experience. That being said, we are recording here outside at a hotel. You might hear some Southern California sounds in the background, but that should just increase the ambiance as you are listening to a story about the Bighorns. If you are not aware, this is part 2 of a 2-part podcast episode. This is called That Time Things Went Downhill Pretty Much from the Beginning, Part 2. If you missed out on Part 1, be sure to go back and listen to Part 1 before listening to this story, because you will be pretty lost if you just jump in on Part 2, though probably not as lost as Troop 41. In fact, that's where we start in Part 2. We are following the saga of Troop 41, yet another episode in their much fabled history, going down Carroway Canyon. And that is where we pick up, at the bottom of the canyon. Troop 41 has just made it down into the bottom, with Dylan clearing out a lot of the trees. So, here goes. Part 2. It was a group effort, but we finally managed to get Dylan back on his feet, with help from a couple ropes and the come-along Dylan's dad had packed for him. And then we were on our way. Aside from the occasional spasm, my quads had recovered from the trek down into the bottom of the canyon. Pine trees swayed in a gentle breeze, and the white limestone rock of the cliff faces above us gleamed in the mid-morning sunlight. The fragrant smell of lodgepole pine needles wafted around us, and aside from the sound of boys and men tramping along, the mountain was still. Before long, the quiet was broken by a rhythmic metallic clanging. "Hey, Scoutmaster Jones, what's that noise?" Marty asked. "That'll be the ram," Dad replied. "The ram?" Marty said, puzzled. "You'll see," I grinned, passing Marty. From the bottom of Carroway Canyon, we hiked upward a short distance to the spring that feeds the stock tank up at our family cabin, and there we saw the source of the clanging. An aging gravity-fed water ram pump was bolted to a small concrete pad, and a black pipe issuing from its side carried water up the canyon side to the stock tank. Each cycle of the water ram resulted in a loud clang, accompanied by a spurt of water. The whole thing was pretty marvelous, and the fact that it could run with only the force of gravity and water pressure made it a great solution to pumping water uphill in a remote mountain canyon where electricity wasn't available to run a pump. The water issuing from the spring was as pure and potable as any bottled water, and we paused there to refill our water bottles and Camelback hydration pouches. Something about water from a limestone spring is just magical. If you've never had the opportunity to drink from a limestone spring, it may be you've never been crazy enough to hike somewhere like we did, or maybe you just have a healthy fear of giardia. With the spring water sloshing in our bellies, we all felt rejuvenated as we set off once again down the canyon. We had barely left the spring behind when it happened. We were clambering over some rocks made slippery by the water spraying from the ram, Dad at the lead, when he slipped. It could have happened to anybody, and certainly under less serious circumstances, but it just had to happen on this particular hike. Dad didn't even fall, but one leg kind of shot off to the side, and as we watched, he caught himself with a jerk. Immediately, we could tell something was wrong, mostly by Dad's choice of vocabulary, but also by the way he began hobbling around and grabbing the back of his leg. "Dad, are you all right?" I hollered. "I think I just pulled a hammy," he grunted, hopping around on one leg in obvious pain. "Ooh, ah, ooh," he gasped each time he put weight on his left leg. After a few moments of anxious silence, during which the troop watched Dad with concerned expressions, he straightened up and gave us a tight smile. "I'll be all right," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "Are you sure?" Shane asked. Dad nodded and put a little more weight on his hiking stick. "Let's keep on going." Before too long, we came upon the headwaters of Carroway Creek, which spewed out of a hole in the ground. The creek runs underground for about 5 miles in an enormous limestone cave before emerging partway down the canyon. "Look at that," said Jim. "I actually haven't ever seen where the creek starts." "Yeah, that's pretty impressive," I nodded. "Now where are the fish?" Dad laughed as he leaned heavily on Tom, his trusty walking stick. "We'll find fish soon enough. We haven't reached the area where we usually go fishing yet. Tonight we'll camp in that area, and you boys can catch all the fish you want." If there's one thing us boys loved, it was catching fish. In fact, that was the one thing we looked forward to most about this hike. Carroway was famous for its cutthroat and brook trout, and we couldn't wait to break out our poles and catch some fish. "Let's keep going," Shane said. "We've still got a ways to go before we can set up camp." It was about this time we discovered there wasn't really a trail down Carroway Canyon. I admit we hadn't expected to find one. Carroway wasn't exactly a hotbed for hikers. Much of the canyon was bordered by private land, and it was pretty hard to get to. Most places worth going tend to be that way, though. Here, let's go up on the south side of the canyon where there aren't a bunch of trees. I bet we can make some headway there, Dad suggested as he hobbled along. By now it was getting on toward noon, and the August sun was starting to stab down into the canyon, bathing the southern side of the canyon in brilliant light and what was quickly becoming suffocating heat. I thought the mountains were supposed to be cooler, I panted as we scrabbled along the side of the creek. To Dylan's credit, he did marvelously with his still bulging pack. I don't think I heard him complain once, though I did notice he still had to crawl over some of the larger rocks rather than stepping up onto them. Thank goodness we were going downhill. Packing all of our gear up a mountain would have been a lot more challenging than going down the canyon. In an effort to cover ground, we hiked quickly with the creek below us on our left. Wistfully, we looked down to the creek far below us, where we passed up beautiful fishing holes I was just certain would contain some magnificent trout. Don't worry, we'll have plenty of time to fish tonight and tomorrow, Dad reminded us. Let's keep moving so we can set up our campsite at a decent hour. By the time we reached an area we recognized, we were all soaked in sweat, except for Wilt, who never seemed to tire. All of the members of Troop 41 were attired in pretty much the same way, with jeans and a t-shirt serving as the preferred uniform for our mountain excursion. I've seen people wear shorts while hiking, but I've always considered that to be an open invitation to get your legs destroyed by the mountain. If you stick to a trail all the time, then maybe exposing your legs is all right, but Troop 41 seldom enjoyed that luxury. Back when Eli was Scoutmaster, he would routinely ignore a beautiful trail in order to, quote-unquote, save time and, quote-unquote, cut the distance, as he liked to call it. His time and effort-saving techniques usually involve climbing straight up the side of a mountain or clambering over downed timber. If you're going to stick to the trail, then maybe you would be justified in wearing shorts, but our straight-line approach to hiking called for a good pair of jeans. In Carroway Canyon alone, there were at least a dozen ways to destroy a fresh set of legs. There were large rocks that threatened to scrape the skin off your knees and shins. Greasewood that sported large thorns that would pierce even the thickest hides and didn't respect even the most well-toned legs grew in abundance. Bloodthirsty biting flies hovered around us in hordes, and in some of the more bare areas there were even prickly pear cacti. When my dad was a kid, one of his cousins came to visit from Salt Lake City. Upon his arrival, Dad and Uncle Greg couldn't help but notice their city-dwelling cousin's legs were sun-kissed, a fact he seemed quite proud of. Dad and Greg were still wearing bell-bottom jeans, and it was 1980, a fact their cousin pointed out with some disdain. However, once they got out on the ranch and the cousin's well-tanned legs were exposed to the full brunt of a Wyoming sheep ranch, they started to look quite a bit different, largely due to some 20,000 swollen mosquito bites and a collection of scrapes and scratches. Soon he too sported some bell-bottom jeans. If there was one downside to our choice of attire, it was how hot we were by the time we reached the campsite. When we finally stopped to survey the area where we planned to make camp, the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the long grass and dried it into prickly yellow straws that crunched under our feet. "It's pretty flat," Wilton remarked, nodding appreciatively as we dropped our packs and began unpacking our tents. "Yeah, a lot flatter than some of the places we camped with Eli," Fred agreed. "Remember that time we camped on that rock shelf during a thunderstorm? We all woke up in a pile at the bottom of the tent. It was like trying to sleep on a tin roof." "Haha, yeah, I remember," I replied. The ground trembled slightly as Dylan dropped his pack, and he crumpled to the ground in a heap. "Would you like some help with your tent?" Wilt asked. I was surprised once again by how much energy Wilt had, even after hiking all day. In order to be in half as good a shape as Wilt was when I reached his age, I'm pretty sure my health would actually have to improve as I got older, rather than getting worse. "Sure," Dylan grunted, giving a slight nod. Dad sank down on a nearby rock and let out a long sigh as he stretched out his injured leg. "How's the hammy, Dad?" Fred asked. "Like skinny jeans on a fat kid," Dad said. Fred and I shared a worried look. Evidently, the pain and heat were getting to Dad. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked. Dad grinned. "Pretty tight." Fred and I shook our heads and groaned. There's no place, no matter how remote, that is safe from a dad joke. "Would you boys mind setting up the tent tonight?" Dad asked. "I'm going to try and stay off this leg." "Sure, no problem," I said. "We've got it." I wanted to get the tent set up as soon as possible, but I knew that wasn't going to happen. I've commented previously on Fred's obsession with finding the perfect spot for a tent, and that night was no different. I'm convinced Fred wouldn't set up a tent on a perfectly level concrete pad until he had surveyed every square inch, just in case there was a spot that happened to be more favorable than another. As it was, even Fred couldn't find a level spot to pitch the tent, but he did manage to locate a spot without any rocks, or at least without any visible ones. Based on previous experience, though, I was sure they would find their way under the most sensitive parts of our backs as soon as darkness fell. Everyone who's well acquainted with them knows that rocks are most active at night, after all. We got the tent all set up and even threw the rainfly on, though the clear skies and parched landscape sure didn't suggest a high chance of precipitation. After rolling out our sleeping pads and sleeping bags, we hit the creek to do some fishing. Dad stretched out in the tent and closed his eyes. When we left, Dylan's orange 8-man tent was just about set up, and it looked like Marty and Jim had decided to bunk with him. So far, the hike had been pretty great by our standards. Sure, Dad was hurting, but he was still able to hike and crack jokes. No doubt he would be all rested up come morning. We had seen some pretty beautiful country, spent quality time with our troop, and, best of all, we were on a campout with Dad. The only thing that would have made it better would have been if we had caught a couple trout before we had to cook dinner. But as it was, dusk was coming on by the time we got over to the creek. We just decided to purify some water with the pump and head back. That evening, we built a campfire, and Shane regaled us with a story about Samson from the Old Testament. Us boys always liked the story about how Samson killed 1,000 Philistines with a donkey's jawbone. When Shane got to that part, Jim said, "He killed 1,000 with a donkey's jawbone?" "Sure did," Shane replied. Jim whistled. "Wowee! I bet the Philistines were just glad he didn't have the whole head." As expected, a rogue rock managed to find its way beneath my sleeping pad somewhere around midnight, and it dedicated itself to gouging a hole in my left kidney while I was trying to get some sleep. Kidney stones are even worse in the mountains. At least Dad and Fred didn't smell too bad after just one day of hiking, I reasoned while trying to find a spot where the rock wasn't. With some effort, I managed to drift off to sleep. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. With sleep-swollen eyes, Jim, Dylan, and Marty rolled out of Dylan's 8-man tent, yawning and stretching. Fred and I crawled out of the tent first, then turned around to see where Dad was at. "Oh, geez, this leg got a lot stiffer overnight," Dad groaned, dragging the leg behind him like a dead log as he exited his sleeping bag. "Are you going to be able to hike today?" I asked. "Oh yeah, I'm sure I will," Dad said, waving us off as he struggled to pull on his boots. "Besides, it's all downhill today. It'll be easy." Apparently, no one had informed Carroway Canyon it was supposed to be an easy hike, because within a mile of our campsite, it started to look more like one of the death marches that made Troop 41 so notorious. What had been a deep canyon with sloping tree-covered sides and ample space on either side of the creek, with at least the semblance of a trail, quickly became a deep gash in the earth, with 500-foot sheer rock walls on either side that hugged the creek so closely a rattlesnake would have had a hard time getting through without getting wet. Finally, Dad had to stop hobbling along and take a break to assess the situation. He balanced on the edge of the creek and managed to find a spot where only his toes were getting wet, then leaned back against one of the rocks that made up the canyon wall while he took a swig from his Camelback. He grunted after he finished drinking. "Our trail seems to have disappeared." I personally had made the same observation about an hour previous, but decided it would be best not to point this out. Balancing on the edge of the creek with a full pack required most of my attention anyway. "Yeah, it's getting a little tight down here," Shane agreed. "Maybe we can get up the south face a bit and follow the elk trails." Us boys peered up at the cliff to our right and scanned its face for quote-unquote elk trails. Shane must have had more experience with elk trails than me, because I sure couldn't see any of them. "Gee, Dylan," Fred said, "I was getting worried you wouldn't get the full Troop 41 experience, what with this being an easy hike down the canyon and all. But things are shaping up pretty good now, aren't they, Dad?" The rest of us boys nodded in agreement, and Dad swallowed. "Well, I don't know if easy is the term I would use at this point," he said. "Hey, we're still going downhill though, aren't we?" I grinned. That was when Carroway Canyon surprised us all by producing a long stretch of downhill that felt more like uphill than any descent I had ever experienced. Once we got away from the creek, Dad started trying to find the elk trail Shane had referred to, but it was awfully slow going. If an elk had ever traversed the path we were following, it must have been moving at a pretty good clip, because it hadn't left any evidence of its passing that I could detect. Again, we found ourselves sweating under the full gaze of the afternoon sun, and when I looked off in the distance, heat shimmered off the canyon walls where the creek turned a bend a couple miles downstream. Dylan was again sharing more of his wealth, even though he protested that he was fine, as the leaders removed more items from his pack. Before the Carroway Canyon hike, I didn't even know they sold 10-pound bags of prunes. As the afternoon wore on, Wilton distinguished himself as an excellent pathfinder. Where I saw a mess of rocks and greasewood, Wilton picked out a trail. Time and again we lost our way, but Wilton made his way to the front of the group and pointed out a path. At one point, we decided to scramble to the top of a rocky outcrop that jutted up from the canyon wall, hoping the canyon would widen out on the other side. The heat was growing unbearable, and all that hiking downhill was starting to get the best of us as we clawed our way up the rocky hill. The gravel slipped out from beneath our feet, and we gripped handfuls of greasewood to hoist ourselves up one agonizing step at a time. "I guess sometimes you have to climb up to go down," Ike gasped, pulling himself up the steep grade. Shane pushed on Dylan's pack from below, while Wilton hauled on one of Dylan's arms from above. Our muscles burned, and sweat dripped down each face. Mosquitoes buzzed around us, and with each labored breath, we sucked in small clouds of the flying bloodsuckers ourselves, then spit them out again. "Come on, boys," Dad grunted, struggling up the hill and wedging his walking stick between rocks to give himself some extra leverage. He was limping like a mule with a bum leg, and his breath came in ragged gasps. "We got this. Just a little farther." Just when I was beginning to think we couldn't take any more of this downhill, we made it to the top of the hill. There, in what could only have been an act of divine benevolence, we found a spring bubbling up from the rocks. Completely exhausted, we sank down by the cool water, and I extracted the water pump from my pack. "Let's take a breather," Dad said, and we all enjoyed a much-needed break. Shane got the other pump going, and we topped off all the boys' waters, though we didn't refill all of Dylan's bottles. Even he thought 5 liters was excessive at this point. Unfortunately, from our vantage point, the canyon didn't seem to be getting any wider, nor the walls any less steep. It was about 4 in the afternoon, and as we sat and sipped the clear, cold water, a realization began to dawn on all of us. This wasn't going to be a 2-day hike. Meanwhile, Mom was waiting at the bottom of Carroway Canyon where we were supposed to emerge, and she had a pile of hot pizzas. Caldwell was in the bus with her, and she kept glancing at her watch, her anxiety growing by the minute. "They should have been here an hour ago," Mom breathed. "Where are they?" As the two of them sat and waited, the light began to fade and an orange sunset spread across the west horizon behind them. The pizzas grew cold, and Caldwell grew restless. "Mommy, where is Daddy? Where's Fred and Al?" he asked. "I don't know," she fretted. "They couldn't have gotten lost. They are literally hiking down a canyon." Finally, as darkness fell, Mom pulled out her phone and dialed a number. She put the phone to her ear and waited for a few moments, then said, "Greg? Yeah, it's me. They haven't come out of the canyon yet." "No, they can't be lost. They're just following the canyon, right?" She listened for a bit, worry clouding her face, and nodded. "Do you want to call them, or should I?" "Okay, sounds good." "Call who, Mommy?" Caldwell asked when Mom had hung up. Mom fastened her seatbelt and frowned. "Search and rescue." There you go. Part 2 of Untold, of that time things went downhill pretty much from the beginning. And just as Troop 41 found that their 2-day hike had unexpectedly turned into a 3-day hike, this 2-part podcast has unexpectedly turned into a 3-part podcast because there is way more of this story, and I have hit about a half hour of recording. So, we're going to stretch this one out into a 3rd episode, which I will release in 2 weeks when you find out what happened to Troop 41 after their 2-day hike suddenly became a 3-day hike. It has been a lot of fun writing this episode and reliving some of the memories of Troop 41. As always, a big shout out to Judy from Otto. She's the one who reminded me of this story, and I'm writing it because she sent me an email to let me know she still wanted to hear my rendition of this particular hike on the podcast. If you have a story you'd like me to write about, be sure to drop me a line. You can shoot me an email at untoldtalesthepodcast@gmail.com or message me on Facebook. Our Facebook page is Untold Tales from This Side of Nowhere, and you can find us on Facebook. If you could, please go give us a good review on Apple Podcasts. If you don't have a 5-star review to leave, just don't leave one, But yeah, we would sure appreciate any reviews you can leave on Apple Podcast. That makes our podcast easier to find. And it's been great sharing this story with you. As always, this has been another untold tale from this side of nowhere, where we work twice as hard for half as much and still find time for the important things, like fishing. See you next time, folks.